The desert was quiet in a way that unsettled experienced men. Not silent, never silent, but empty, stretched thin, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Erwin Rommel stood over a map that no longer behaved the way maps were supposed to. Lines that should have meant certainty now raised questions. Arrows that once promised clarity now hinted at intention. For weeks, he had been winning. That alone made the moment dangerous. "I thought I was facing an army," Rommel would later say, "but it was one man." At the time, he did not yet know that. What he knew was this: the Americans were not where they should have been. Not late, not early, wrong. Rommel had built his reputation on movement, fast, decisive, ruthless movement. In North Africa, hesitation was death. You struck before your enemy finished thinking, and you kept striking until the sand itself seemed to belong to you. That was how he had beaten the British. That was how he had humiliated commanders who followed rules while he rewrote them. And now the Americans had arrived. At first, Rommel was not impressed. The reports described a general who was loud, theatrical, obsessed with appearances. George S. Patton talked too much. He moved too fast. He believed too deeply in destiny. Men like that, Rommel believed, burned brightly and briefly. Rommel trusted systems, terrain, logistics, probability. Patton trusted something else, but Rommel did not see that yet. On paper, the situation favored the Axis. Rommel's supply lines were strained, yes, but manageable. The Allies were still organizing, still learning the desert, still bleeding from inexperience. Rommel had seen this before. New enemies always arrived confident. They always made the same mistake. They assumed speed could replace understanding. Rommel studied their likely routes, their fuel limitations, the roads that were not really roads at all, just suggestions carved into sand by men who hoped. He predicted where they would advance. He predicted where they would hesitate. He predicted where they would overextend. And according to every calculation, the American general named Patton would do exactly what impulsive men always did. He would attack straight ahead. So Rommel prepared for that. He positioned armor where it would hurt most. He allowed space where he wanted the enemy to feel safe. He shaped the battlefield not to resist Patton, but to invite him. The Desert Fox had never lost when the enemy played the game he expected, which is why the first report unsettled him. Patton's units had appeared sooner than anticipated, but not where speed alone would place them. Their movement was aggressive, yet strangely cautious, bold, yet measured. Rommel dismissed it. Early war confusion, he thought. Inexperienced officers overcorrecting. Logistical noise. Then came the second report. American forces had shifted direction without a clear tactical reason. Not retreating, not advancing, repositioning. Rommel leaned back, eyes narrowing. Why move there? The terrain offered no advantage. The supply routes were inefficient. There was no obvious objective. It was illogical. Rommel marked it on the map anyway. The third report arrived before nightfall. Patton had changed direction again. This time, Rommel did not speak. He stood silently, fingers resting on the table, eyes tracing patterns that refused to align. A lesser commander would have grown angry. Rommel grew curious, because chaos was one thing. Repeated, consistent chaos was another. Still, Rommel believed he understood the type of man Patton was. Men like Patton needed action. They needed momentum. They chased victories because standing still forced them to think, and thinking was not their strength. Rommel believed Patton was rushing. What he did not yet realize was that Patton was pacing. In another part of the desert, Patton stood before his own map, looking nothing like the caricature his enemies imagined. The speeches, the ivory-handled pistols, the theatrics. They were not accidents, they were signals. Patton knew the Germans were watching. He wanted them to see exactly what he chose to show. He wanted Rommel to believe in the myth. Because the moment an enemy believes they understand you, they stop questioning. And Rommel, for now, was still confident. He believed the Americans were probing. He believed they were feeling their way forward. He believed they would commit too early. So he waited. And that was the moment the balance quietly began to shift. Not with an explosion, not with a breakthrough, but with a thought Rommel did not yet finish forming. a thought that sounded like this: "They are not reacting to me." He brushed it aside. The desert played tricks on the mind. Fatigue created patterns where none existed. Rommel returned to his calculations. He adjusted troop placements. He refined supply expectations. He prepared for the inevitable clash that would confirm his assumptions. He was still winning. Which is why the silence between the reports felt heavier than artillery. Because somewhere in that silence, George Patton was not advancing. He was studying. And Rommel, without realizing it, was being drawn into a battle that would not be decided by firepower, but by anticipation. For the first time in the campaign, Rommel was not dictating the tempo. He simply had not noticed yet. Rommel believed time was on his side. The longer the Americans delayed decisive action, the more predictable they would become. In war, hesitation usually meant uncertainty. Uncertainty led to mistakes, and mistakes were where Rommel thrived. He reviewed the latest intelligence with calm efficiency. Fuel shortages, communication delays, officers still learning how to operate in desert conditions. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: the enemy was not ready. So Rommel shaped his strategy around patience. He allowed the Americans room to move, confident they would eventually reveal their true intent. He adjusted defensive lines, not to stop Patton, but to channel him. Rommel had always believed that a battlefield was less about strength and more about pressure. Apply it in the right place, and the enemy collapses under their own weight. Patton, Rommel assumed, would feel that pressure soon enough. The Americans advanced again, but not as expected. Instead of committing to a major thrust, Patton's forces advanced in fragments, probing here, pausing there, withdrawing just as quickly as they arrived. It looked indecisive. Rommel smiled at that. Fragmented advances wasted fuel. They exhausted crews. They produced no strategic gain. Rommel marked their movements and began to see what he believed was the pattern. Patton was testing, not Rommel, the desert. Learning distances, measuring response times, mapping German reactions. A necessary phase, Rommel thought. An inevitable one. Rommel permitted it. He did not counterattack aggressively. He did not reveal his full strength. He responded just enough to be seen. He wanted Patton to believe the Axis defenses were thin, vulnerable. Rommel had done this before, invited an enemy forward until retreat became impossible. Each day reinforced his confidence. American radio traffic increased, chaotic and undisciplined. Units appeared to operate with excessive autonomy. Orders changed frequently. To Rommel, it confirmed everything he believed. This was not a carefully orchestrated force. It was an energetic one. But energy was not precision. Rommel reported to headquarters with cautious optimism. The Americans were bold, he said, but predictable. They would overextend, and when they did, he would break them. What Rommel did not know was that the radio traffic was not chaos, it was theater. Patton understood German intelligence methods better than most Allied commanders. He knew what the enemy listened for. He knew which behaviors signaled weakness, so he manufactured them. Orders were transmitted openly and repeatedly. Units were encouraged to speak freely on the radio. Movements were made visible, almost exaggerated. Patton wanted Rommel to see confusion, because confusion invites confidence, and confidence dulls curiosity. Rommel's staff began to share his assessment. The Americans lacked discipline. They lacked patience. They would strike too soon. Rommel listened. He always listened. But deep down, something unsettled him. The Americans were reckless, but not careless. They exposed themselves, but never fully. Every time Rommel expected a decisive commitment, it did not come. The advance would stall. The units would reposition. The pressure would dissolve. Rommel told himself it was fear. He told himself Patton was hesitating at the last moment. But hesitation usually leaves fingerprints. This did not. It was controlled. Rommel noticed it while studying a fuel report. An American unit had maneuvered aggressively, then withdrawn, consuming just enough fuel to suggest confidence, but not enough to indicate desperation. That was not accidental. Rommel closed the report and stared at the map. Why commit resources to a movement you do not intend to exploit, unless the movement itself is the objective? The thought passed quickly. Rommel dismissed it as overanalysis. He had learned long ago that too much imagination could be as dangerous as too little. So he returned to what he trusted: numbers, distances, timing. And by every measurable standard, the Axis still held the advantage. The Americans were spreading themselves thin. Their supply lines lengthened with every maneuver. Sooner or later, Rommel would identify the moment of weakness. He believed Patton was exhausting himself. In reality, Patton was measuring Rommel's responses, each pause, each delay, each restraint. Patton was learning where Rommel felt safe, and Rommel, convinced he was controlling the battlefield, continued to shape a trap designed for an enemy who would never step into it. The illusion of control remained intact, but illusions do not collapse all at once. They fracture, and the first fracture had already formed. Rommel simply did not recognize it yet. Patterns were Rommel's strength. He had built his career on recognizing them faster than anyone else. The moment an enemy revealed habit, hesitation, or fear. Armies, no matter how different, tended to behave the same way under pressure. Which is why the Americans began to bother him. Not because they were strong, but because they refused to settle into anything familiar. The latest reports arrived just after dawn. Patton's forces had shifted again. Not forward, not back, sideways. Rommel traced the movement with a pencil, then stopped. Sideways movement in the desert was inefficient. It wasted fuel. It offered no immediate advantage. Unless the goal was information. Rommel frowned. He compared the new positions with earlier ones, layering days of movement in his mind. Individually, each maneuver looked careless. Together, they formed something else, a sweep. Patton was not advancing toward a target. He was scanning. Rommel straightened. That realization brought discomfort, not fear. Scanning suggested patience, and patience was dangerous. Still, Rommel told himself it meant nothing. Commanders sometimes drifted when uncertain. They moved because standing still felt worse. Rommel had seen it countless times. But then he noticed the timing. Each American movement coincided precisely with small axis adjustments. Whenever Rommel repositioned armor, Patton's units appeared to react, not immediately, but just late enough to seem coincidental. That delay was what unsettled him. Too fast meant foreknowledge. Too slow meant ignorance. This was neither. It was calibrated. Rommel did not share the thought with his staff. He kept it to himself. Admitting uncertainty too early could spread doubt, and doubt weakened decision-making. Rommel preferred clarity, even if it had to be manufactured. He ordered minor redeployments, testing whether the Americans would respond. They did. Again. Always in ways that maintained ambiguity. Rommel told himself he was reading too much into it. The desert distorted perspective. Heat and fatigue created illusions. Yet the map refused to cooperate. Patton was avoiding strongpoints before Rommel fully committed to them. He was bypassing areas just before they became dangerous. And when he approached a position that looked vulnerable, he withdrew before Rommel could exploit it. It was as if Patton knew where the pressure would be, before it existed. Rommel's confidence did not vanish, but it narrowed. He began to look not at where Patton was, but where he was not. And the absences told a story. Patton never attacked where Rommel expected him to. Not once. That was statistically improbable. Rommel remembered his own early campaigns. Speed, audacity, disruption. He had used chaos to paralyze enemies who relied on rigid planning. Now someone was doing something similar, but refined. Patton was not disrupting Rommel's forces. He was disrupting Rommel's thinking. Rommel felt irritation creep in. He disliked enemies who refused to commit. They delayed resolution. They forced constant recalculation. Rommel preferred decisive action, victory or defeat, quickly determined. This was neither. It was erosion. Rommel ordered a limited engagement, confident Patton would seize the opportunity. Patton did not. Instead, the Americans pulled back, allowing Rommel a minor, unsatisfying success. Rommel took the ground. and immediately realized it meant nothing. The position offered no leverage, no follow-up, no exploitation. It had been offered. Rommel stared at the map long after the reports ended. For the first time, he considered a possibility he found deeply uncomfortable. Patton was not reacting to Rommel's moves. Rommel was reacting to Patton's intentions. That inversion was subtle, dangerous, because once you begin responding to what you think the enemy wants, you are no longer leading. Rommel shook his head. He dismissed the idea. Patton was an American, new to desert warfare, too emotional, too visible. A man like that could not possibly be this deliberate. Rommel chose to trust his original assessment, and in doing so, he missed the moment when the pattern became undeniable. Because while Rommel debated probabilities, Patton reached a conclusion. He had learned how Rommel thought, and once you understand how a mind moves, you can guide it. Rommel still believed he was shaping the battlefield. In reality, the battlefield was now shaping him. Rommel slept less, not because of fear. He had long ago learned to function without it, but because his mind refused to settle. Each report added information without adding clarity. That was the problem. War usually simplified things. As pressure increased, options narrowed. Here, the opposite was happening. Rommel reviewed the map again, this time in silence, dismissing his staff early. He wanted to see it alone, without interpretation, without reassurance. He marked the last 10 American movements with small, precise lines. Then he connected them. The shape that emerged was not an advance, it was a shadow. Patton's forces were moving in relation to Rommel's decisions, not the terrain. Rommel leaned back slowly. That realization carried a quiet weight. If Patton was shaping his movements around Rommel's reactions, then the American was not chasing victory. He was shaping expectation. Rommel felt irritation give way to something sharper, respect. But respect alone was not enough to change his situation. He tested the hypothesis. Rommel ordered a feint, a deliberate misallocation of armor, designed to provoke a predictable response. If Patton reacted, Rommel would know. The response came. Not immediate, not direct. American units adjusted position just enough to acknowledge the threat, but not enough to commit. They left Rommel uncertain whether the feint had been detected or ignored. Rommel exhaled slowly. Patton was not guessing. He was anticipating. The battlefield had become a conversation, and Patton was responding before Rommel finished speaking. This unsettled Rommel more than any frontal assault could have, because it suggested Patton was operating one step ahead, not tactically, but psychologically. Rommel's advantage had always been speed of decision. He could assess, decide, and act faster than his opponents. Now that advantage was narrowing. Rommel began to feel constrained by his own reputation. The Desert Fox was expected to strike boldly, to outmaneuver, to surprise. Patton knew that, and Rommel realized, with growing discomfort, that his own legend had become a liability. Patton was not countering Rommel's moves. He was predicting them. Rommel reviewed Patton's earlier actions, the theatrics, the speeches, the deliberate visibility. They had not been arrogance. They had been camouflage. Patton had wanted to be underestimated. Rommel closed his eyes briefly. He did not like what this implied. If Patton was deliberately presenting himself as impulsive, then every assumption Rommel had made rested on false ground, and Rommel had built his entire operational plan on those assumptions. Still, Rommel was not beaten, not yet. Understanding the problem was the first step toward solving it. He shifted strategy. Rommel slowed his tempo. He delayed commitments. He withheld information. He reduced visible movement. If Patton was reading patterns, Rommel would deny him patterns. For a moment, it seemed to work. American movements paused. Radio chatter quieted. Rommel felt a brief return of control. Then Patton moved again. This time, not in response to Rommel's actions, but in anticipation of his restraint. Rommel stared at the report. Patton had advanced into a zone Rommel had deliberately left untouched, assuming it would not be threatened. Rommel felt a tightness in his chest. Patton was no longer reacting to Rommel's decisions. He was reacting to Rommel's thinking. That was the moment questions replaced certainty. Not panic, not despair. Just doubt, precise and surgical. Rommel began asking questions he had never needed to ask before. What if the Americans were not overextending? What if their supply movements were calculated, not strained? What if every pause was intentional? The answers did not comfort him. Rommel realized something else. He was no longer waiting for Patton to make a mistake. He was waiting for Patton to reveal his intention. And Patton was in no hurry to do so. The initiative, that invisible, fragile thing, had shifted. Rommel could feel it, and once felt, it could not be unfelt. Rommel believed traps were visible to those who looked closely enough. They had edges. They required commitment. They depended on arrogance. That belief had saved him more times than he could count, which is why he did not recognize this one. Patton's next move appeared reckless. American forces pushed forward along an exposed route, stretching supply lines and presenting what looked like an opportunity too clean to ignore. Rommel studied it carefully. The advance cut across terrain that offered little cover. It invited counterattack. It suggested impatience. Everything about it aligned with Rommel's original assessment of Patton. Rommel hesitated, not because he doubted the opportunity, but because he doubted his doubt. He reminded himself that overthinking could paralyze action. So he acted. Rommel ordered a concentrated response. Armor moved into position. Artillery followed. The pieces aligned for a decisive blow. For the first time in weeks, the battlefield felt familiar again. This was the kind of engagement Rommel understood. This was where speed and precision mattered. And for a brief moment, it worked. American units fell back. Resistance stiffened, then weakened. The Axis advance regained momentum. Rommel felt the satisfaction of regained initiative. Then the reports changed. Patton's retreat was not disorderly. It was measured. Units withdrew just far enough to maintain cohesion, just fast enough to avoid encirclement. Rommel pressed harder, and that was when the trap closed, quietly. Axis supply convoys began to lag. Fuel consumption rose faster than anticipated. Communications grew strained. Rommel realized the American advance had not been about territory. It had been about distance. Patton had drawn Rommel forward, extending his own lines while compressing American flexibility. Rommel slowed, but slowing did not restore the balance. Because Patton was already shifting, American forces reappeared on Rommel's flanks, not in force, but in presence. Enough to threaten, enough to distract. Rommel found himself committing units defensively while still advancing offensively. It was inefficient, and inefficiency in the desert was unforgiving. Rommel recognized the shape of the problem. Patton had not built a trap in space. He had built it in sequence. Each step forced Rommel into the next. Each decision reduced alternatives. Rommel attempted to disengage. Patton did not pursue aggressively. Instead, he maintained pressure, just enough to prevent reorganization. Rommel felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always believed that initiative belonged to the commander willing to act. Now he understood that initiative could also belong to the commander willing to wait. Patton had waited. He had waited for Rommel to confirm every assumption he held about him. And Rommel had done exactly that. Rommel reviewed the timeline again, the lateral movements, the pauses, the false vulnerabilities. They were not mistakes, they were invitations. Rommel felt a familiar sensation, not fear, but clarity. The kind that arrives too late to prevent consequences, but early enough to understand them. Patton had not defeated Rommel in a battle. He had shaped Rommel's decisions until defeat became the logical outcome. Rommel issued new orders, focused on consolidation and preservation. The objective was no longer dominance, it was survival. And that was when Rommel understood the depth of the maneuver. Patton had forced him into a defensive mindset without ever delivering a decisive blow. The trap was not the engagement. The trap was the realization that Rommel was no longer choosing. He was responding. Rommel did not react immediately. He studied the map the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, not searching for pain, but for damage already done. The battlefield no longer showed possibilities, it showed consequences. Every position he occupied demanded resources he no longer had in abundance. Every withdrawal created openings he could not afford to leave exposed. Rommel understood then that the sequence could not be reversed. Patton had designed it that way. This was not a sudden collapse, it was a controlled narrowing. Rommel traced the American movements backward in his mind, step by step, removing the illusion of chaos. What emerged was not improvisation, it was choreography. Each maneuver had prepared the conditions for the next. Each pause had allowed Rommel to commit prematurely. Rommel felt a quiet, almost clinical recognition. He had been maneuvered, not outfought, not surprised. Maneuvered. The difference mattered. Rommel had always believed that understanding the battlefield was enough. Now he saw the flaw in that belief. Patton had understood Rommel. Rommel sat back, hands folded, breathing slow. He was not angry. Anger wasted clarity. He felt something rarer, intellectual defeat. Patton had anticipated not only Rommel's tactics, but his temperament, his need for momentum, his intolerance for ambiguity. Patton had fed him uncertainty in controlled doses, knowing Rommel would resolve it through action. And every action had carried him further from advantage. Rommel realized the cruel elegance of it. The battlefield itself had become irrelevant. This was a contest of expectation. Rommel remembered dismissing Patton as theatrical, impulsive, noisy. He understood now that those traits had been deliberately amplified. They were bait. Rommel had taken it. He allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. He had respected cunning enemies before, but rarely had he encountered one willing to let his opponent believe he was superior. Rommel spoke quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "He did not force my hand," he said. "He guided it." The words settled heavily. Rommel adjusted his strategy again, not to win, but to limit damage. That admission, even unspoken, marked a turning point. From that moment on, Rommel no longer asked where Patton would strike. He asked what Patton wanted him to believe, and the answers were unsettling. Every apparent opportunity became suspect. Every opening looked staged. Patton had taken something Rommel valued deeply: confidence in his own reading of the situation. Without that, speed meant nothing. Rommel felt the pressure of time close in. Not the ticking of a clock, but the narrowing of options. The realization was complete. Patton was no longer responding to the battlefield was responding to Patton. And Rommel, for the first time in the campaign, understood he was one step behind. Not tactically, but cognitively. That was the defeat that mattered most. Rommel was not a man who spoke lightly about his enemies. Praise, when it came, was measured. Criticism, precise. In the days that followed, as the campaign continued under mounting strain, Rommel began to articulate what he had understood, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. "He did not defeat my army," Rommel said. "He defeated my expectations." Those words carried weight because Rommel knew what they implied. Battles were fought with men and machines. Campaigns were won by understanding. Patton had targeted the second. Rommel described Patton not as reckless, but as intentional. Not chaotic, but selective. "He allowed me to believe I was faster," Rommel observed. "And while I was moving, he was deciding." Rommel recognized the discipline required for such an approach. It demanded restraint, the ability to delay action even when opportunity appeared favorable. That restraint had never been Rommel's weakness, until now. Rommel admitted, privately, that he had mistaken visibility for simplicity. Patton's constant presence, his noise, his speed, they created an illusion of urgency. Rommel had responded to that illusion, and in responding, he had ceded initiative. "He made me chase a version of him that did not exist," Rommel reflected, "and by the time I realized that, I was already committed." There was no bitterness in his assessment, only precision. Rommel did not claim Patton was flawless. He did not suggest the outcome was inevitable. What he acknowledged was more unsettling. Patton had fought a different war. While Rommel optimized for terrain and movement, Patton optimized for perception. Rommel understood now that perception shaped decision, and decision shaped outcome. He described Patton as a commander who understood when not to fight, and how to make his enemy fight instead. That distinction mattered. Rommel respected strength, he respected speed, but above all, he respected clarity, and Patton had denied him that. In doing so, Patton had achieved what few commanders ever did. He had made Rommel doubt his own judgment, not momentarily, but systematically. Rommel concluded with a statement that would later be paraphrased, simplified, and misunderstood. "He was always one step ahead," Rommel said, "not on the map, but in my mind." That was the truth Rommel accepted, not as defeat, as understanding. Rommel and Patton never met. There was no dramatic confrontation, no exchanged glances across a battlefield. Yet their encounter was real. It unfolded across maps, pauses, assumptions, and decisions made in isolation. Rommel continued to fight with the skill and determination that had defined his career. Patton continued to advance with the momentum that would make his name synonymous with aggression. But something had shifted. Rommel no longer fought an abstract enemy. He fought an intelligence. Patton, for his part, never claimed personal victory over Rommel. He understood that wars were not decided by moments of realization, but by sustained pressure. Yet Patton had achieved something rare. He had forced one of history's most capable commanders to fight a war he did not choose. That was the essence of the encounter. Not destruction, direction. Rommel's experience revealed a truth that extended beyond the desert. In war, and beyond it, the greatest advantage is not strength, it is understanding. Rommel had mastered the mechanics of battle. Patton had mastered the psychology of command. And psychology, once engaged, reshaped everything. Rommel would carry that lesson with him. He had not been defeated by surprise. He had not been overwhelmed by numbers. He had been anticipated. History often remembers battles as collisions of force, but beneath those collisions lie quieter contests. Contests of interpretation, of patience, of restraint. This was one of them. The desert bore no permanent marks of their struggle. Sand shifted, tracks vanished, but the lesson endured. Sometimes the most decisive victory occurs long before the first shot is fired. And sometimes the most profound defeat is the moment you realize your enemy understood you first. That was what Rommel realized. Too late to change the outcome, early enough to understand it.